Nick, if you would like to take it away.
All right. Good morning. Let me share my screen. Okay, great. So this morning I'm going to talk about the evolution of the B-17's tail guns, and we'll talk a little bit about each model, attempts to upgrade the position, my B-17 tail turret that will be on display at the museum, and why I restored it. And before I get into the material, I wanted to mention that everyone is currently on mute, and we'll open up the mics for questions at the end. And I'd like to thank the volunteers and staff of the 390th Memorial Museum and staff at the Pima Air Museum, the Parham Field Museum in England. They were so kind when I was researching the combat history of my granduncle. Thanks to Tony Ritzman and Carl Scholl at Aero Trader in Chino, California, Michael O'Leary at Air Classics, Todd Hackbarth at the Yankee Air Museum, Ty Ramey at the Stockton Field Museum, fellow authors Evo DeYoung, Alan Griffith, and Joe May, and Ted Holgerson from California Airframe. And after the talk, there'll be a live unveiling of the turret on Facebook and Instagram, and I'll put up a slide showing that at the end. So we'll start with a little bit of trivia. What was the first strategic bomber equipped with a tail gunner's position? And if you guess the Ilya Muromets S-25, give yourself extra points for that. World War I, pre-World War I bomber, circa 1916. And to get into the airplanes, the B-17C and D. Notice there's no tail gunner here. In the 1943 movie Air Force, it shows one of the crews taking a hacksaw to the tail compartment and installing a single, let's see, hang on, I gotta make, still seeing my notes?
No.
Okay, sorry about that. So the C&D went into production for the Air Force mainly as trainers to teach the Air Force how to operate a 4-engine bomber, how to fly it. Most of the production went to the Philippines. And as you can see down below in that famous picture from Pearl Harbor, 10 or 12 of them flew right into the battle. And this one was destroyed. This was Raymond Swenson's airplane. There we go. So to improve the tail gunner's defensive position, they came up with the B-17E. This was called the steeplechase. All B-17Es and Fs had it. And notice the gun sight. It's a ring and bead on a stick that's slaved to the guns. And why was it called steeplechase? It had everything to do with how the gunner sat in the turret on what many call the jockey seat. And with the aircraft pitching up and down, it resembled a rider on a steeplechase where a horse and rider jump over fences or other obstacles. And it must have been appropriate because the name stuck. And on the right, we have the seat, the knee pads, the armor plate, and you can't see the guns with the armor plate here. So the gunner had to reach around the armor plate to manipulate both guns. We have the oxygen pressure gauge, demand regulator, and the blinker, heated seat rheostat, and the communications box. And then this is the perspective of the gunner and the view out the sighting window. And this rubber pad was for the gunner to put his chin on so that when he was reaching around the guns and elevating them to the maximum, his arms really weren't long enough. So he had to get his chin down on it. And the visibility out of the steeplechase turret was pretty restricted. You had this big piece of armor plate above the armor glass. There was no upward visibility. And there's another shot of the gun sight. So there were attempts to counter the heavy losses in combat. And here we've got an FW-190 downing a B-17 over France. And one of the major grade attempts was the bomber escort, where they took a B-17, they removed the bombs, they added more guns, 11,000 rounds of ammunition, and they would fly these airplanes on the outside of the formation, so that in theory, the Germans would attack from the sides and they'd get this surprise. But unfortunately, after the main formation dropped its bombs and those airplanes becoming lighter, these bomber escorts were still heavy with ammunition, and they dropped back in the formation and essentially were ineffective. But they did sprout some interesting things. Here you'll notice that the radio room has been removed and a Martin turret has been added and twin waist guns. This was a United Shoe Machinery Company mount, which of course has the same abbreviations as USMC. So a lot of confusion there. And this is what the XB and the YB-40 look like. This was your first time at the bottom left there. You had a chin turret gunner. There was no bombardier on this airplane. And the cross-hatched black area is the armor plate that the gunner hid behind. And the center shows the top turret and the radio room Martin turret. And you'll notice that the top turret extends all the way down to the floor, where the Martin turret was skin supported. And then, of course, you've got the ball turret gunner. And then in the aft section, again, the crosshatch area was armor plate. So you've got the gunner manipulating the guns with a hydraulic mount through the armor plate. And this is what the first incarnation of the XB-40 tail gunner's compartment looked like. You can see there's not a lot of visibility. It had very thick armor glass, about 6 panes thick. So not a lot of visibility. And it retained the B-17F tail gun mount. And on the right, you can see the how the gun sight was slaved. And this is the first optical gun sight. It wasn't really much more than an electronic ring and bead sight, but it was an improvement. And there's the mechanical and the wire that connected the sight to the guns. And then they dropped the heavy armor glass and added this plexiglass unit. But again, it still didn't improve visibility. And then if you look at the tail section of this one, this drawing, it's the Martin midget turret. It was a very lightweight turret, and the guns were moved literally down to the gunner's shin area. And again, hydraulically manipulated. The guns could go, had greater movement range, up 60 and down 55 degrees. And this drawing was found by my friend Alan Griffith in the National Archives, hidden away. And they actually did make some Martin midget turrets. We thought it was just a concept originally, but they did cut some metal for them. They also considered a number of cannon options. Nice drawing for a 37 millimeter cannon, which got to the testing stage. They also considered a 40 millimeter cannon and a 75 millimeter cannon. And they also considered this option for the top turret as well. In the Mediterranean theater, they experimented with 20 millimeter cannons. If you look at the top right photo, you can see a bar that goes from the gun back up towards the gunner, and that was to use the same ring and bead sight for aiming the cannon. And in the center photo, you have both a 20 millimeter cannon and a 50 caliber machine gun. The gunner would use the 50 caliber machine gun to range the target and then open up with the cannon. And this is what I call B-17 what the hell. When I saw this, I couldn't make heads or tails out of it because it's basically a pipe with no rifling in it, much like a shotgun. And it turns out it shot a folding fin 5-inch rocket. And there were cramped quarters, of course, in the tail gunner's compartment. He probably couldn't get off more than one round a minute. And with no breach in there, it looks like he probably was, the compartment would fill with smoke every time he fired it. But the best solution was the Cheyenne modification. And this was built by United Airlines in Cheyenne, Wyoming. So the bombers would be built online to a certain block standard, and then they'd arrive at United for modifications. And this is 4297825, which went to the 379th Bomb Group, Triangle K on the tail, and it was named Phyllis. So the airplanes would be towed in tail first. And at the Cheyenne Center, the modifications included closing up the aircraft with waist gun windows and taking the radio room gun and enclosing it as well. And there's the mount. And this is what the open radio room gun looked like. That gun retracted into the ceiling. And as you can see, he's got the deflector up there to make it easier to manipulate the gun in the slipstream. And here they are at the United Modification Center making oxygen panels. And I'll tell you, I wouldn't want to work for this guy. And this is what the Cheyenne modification kit consisted of. You have tail turret ammo boxes, new tail windows, reflector sight and armor glass. There's the radio room gun mount that I mentioned earlier. Cheek windows, new waist windows, and the turret pumpkin and the turret yoke. And the turret yoke will be important later on. So to convert the steeplechase tail to the Cheyenne tail, they would basically remove the 50 caliber guns and take a cutter and start cutting the airplane apart. Off came the canopy. Then they'd start working in the aft section and just slice and dice. And there was the open section. And while that was happening, they were putting together the parts for the Cheyenne turret kit, making the glass and building the canopy. And here they are putting together the pumpkin, and this is the turret yoke. And that's the area where the shells would eject and the link shoots. So you're in formation with a couple hundred other airplanes, and not only are you battling enemy fighters, but shells and links are raining down on you from the airplanes ahead of you. And here they are installing the Cheyenne kit. And you notice there's no armor plate being installed. It's all just skin. And above on the right side, you can see the armor glass that's turned to the right with the pumpkin as well. And the Cheyenne had an optical sight. Typically, it had the N8A or the N6A. And then down below in the N8A drawing, you can see how they used it for deflection shooting. And that's the finished product. As you can see, that gives the gunner greater range of movement with the 50 cals. And here's a visibility comparison. As you can see on the left, the steeplechase was pretty narrow, where on the right, in the Cheyenne, gave much better view. And at the end, a job well done. The Cheyenne turrets were installed up through the B-17G-80, the B-17G-45 at Douglas, and the Lockheed Vega through the Block 55 airplanes. And all these workers, as the airplanes would come down the line, they had this basically a scroll that went with the airplane. You've got the airplane number at the top. This one happened to be for the B-17 Homesick Angel. It went to Cheyenne, and then it went to the 388th Bomb Group. It was flown by Boardman C. Reed. You can see some of the workers included their address, and I guess they would get letters back from the servicemen. BC Reed was not flying this a couple months later when it ran out of gas and crashed. And if you're ever at the Offutt Air Force Base, there's a B-17F there on display marked as Homesick Angel. And then my B-17 tail gunner's compartment. You can see this is the tail of the B-17G Yankee Lady before it was restored. Two B-17s went to South America after the war as cargo haulers. That was 620 Lima and 621 Lima. The tail gunner's compartment seen here was on one or both of the airplanes, and while in South America, one or both had tail gear failures. The section was repaired, and people who saw this believe that it was repaired by cavemen with stone tools. The B-17s were then acquired by Globe Air in Mesa, Arizona, and this tail section moved around from aircraft to aircraft. And of course, the last one was Yankee Lady. And acquiring this tail turret began my 30-year quest to get it restored. It looked sad. All the other tail turrets laughed at it. It needed a good home. I obtained it in a complex trade, and it might have been scrapped otherwise. There it is in my backyard. So acquiring the turret began my quest for parts. On the left is the correct twin gun mount that came from a guy in Iowa. Mike Kellner and Bill Stanzik built an original seat for me according to the blueprint plans. And let me go back one. So I had made a trade with another restorer. He needed a bunch of B-24 parts for the restoration at Hill, and I gave him what I had acquired. And this is what came back. The pumpkin was fiberglass. The windows weren't right. It was just sad. If you look at the upper right photo, there's a wooden floor in there, and I think the stand was a bootlegged Home Depot cart. So after I got it back, the quest to find original parts began again. I had a job where I did a lot of overnight work. It was about 2 a.m., and I thought I needed a mental break. So I went to eBay to clear my head, and this is what greeted me. All the original parts I needed to complete my turret in one place. Buy it now. So out came the credit card, and I could hear it scream as PayPal processed the transaction. And this is what arrived at my house, the entire Cheyenne kit. It was a real score. So you've got the pumpkin, this is the sight yoke. This is important because all of this stuff hangs off the turret yoke, excuse me. All the parts are bolted onto the turret around this yoke. So without it, it wouldn't look right. And we have the pumpkin. Up in the top left is the oxygen panel made by the Cheyenne workers. This is the gun post, and the 5 prongs that stick out there at the bottom attach it to the pumpkin. And then we have the defroster tube. And the stars of the show are the craftsmen at Aero Trader in Chino. You can see them putting the pieces that from the Cheyenne kit onto the turret, and they had to drill off all the earlier modifications. And this is what the inside of it looks like now. You can see the seat there in the lower position, original bicycle seat and knee pads. And there's the seat raised. So the gunner was basically on his knees for 5 or 6 hours. And the oxygen panel and the communications box. The window works. And here you have the gun installation on the pumpkin and the link chute. And this is the N8A sight behind the armor glass. And it was an amazing restoration by folks at Aero Trader, Tony Ritzman and Carl Scholl. And if you look at it today and think about what they started with, it's a pretty amazing piece of craftsmanship. So why restore a B-17 tail gunner's compartment? My mom's uncle was in World War II. All we know is that he was shot down. We never knew anything else. There were no pictures. He had been selected for the 1936 Olympic Games, but was disqualified by the Germans because he was a lifeguard, and they considered that a professional swimmer. And there he is on the lower right. There were no games in 1940, so he went to work in a bank because he had a finance degree. When World War II came around, and by the time he was trained and reached England, he was 29 years old, so he was quite old for the profession. And here he is standing second from the left. And we never knew anything about him. And I had gone to the bookstore a number of times and seen a book called Mission 376 by Ivo de Young. And it was $80, and that was above my threshold for buying a book. So finally, I broke down and I bought it. I couldn't figure out why the book was calling to me, but when I was reading it, I turned to page 103, and there was this photo that Ivo had found. And that started my quest to find out more. The airplane he was in was Decatur Deb, and this jacket is on display in England at the Parham Airfield Museum. All the bomb symbols at the bottom of the jacket are artistic license because the Decatur Deb only flew 23 missions. And Decatur Deb was shot down on May 28th, 1944, when the 390th Bomb Group was attacking the Rothensee synthetic oil plant. And this was 10 days before D-Day, when the 8th Air Force was concentrating on oil and rail targets. And he was shot down by Staff Sergeant Alfred Binseal, who was one of the leading fighter pilots in JG-1. And on the upper right is a drawing of the airplane he was flying in April, and I would assume in May of that year as well. And down below, they had taken parts of that crash and have rebuilt the airplane, and it's on display in Hanover, Germany. And here's the Rothensee synthetic oil plant after it was bombed by the 8th Air Force. As you can see, they didn't contribute much to the war after that. And Robert Woolfolk's buried at the Ardennes American Cemetery. So in summary, I hope presenting this tail turret will honor those who served, the crew of Decatur Deb, and it's done with great appreciation for the volunteers and staff of the 390th Bomb Group Memorial Museum who honor their memory. Thank you, and I'll be open for questions. And here's the link to the turret unveiling.
Nick, this is simply fantastic.
Thank you very much.
The research that you've done and the results and the presentation are just beyond outstanding.
Thank you. Apologies for the technical issues at the beginning.
Hey, it worked.
Aaron, did you want to open it up to questions?
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to take yourself off mute and ask Nick. This is your opportunity to get those questions answered.
Well, thank you, Nick. This was great to hear. I've known a lot of just the general stuff about the B-17 and the differences between the E's, F's, and G's from the earlier ABCs. But how long from the beginning of getting your tail to what you're going to be unveiling today, what was the total duration of the process, if you have that in mind?
30 years.
30
Wow.
years. Wow. Wow. Thank you.
A lot of things. It was, stagnant here and there for a while, but I was always on the lookout for parts and, trying to find all the right stuff. It's restored to airworthy condition, so if it needed to be, it could be hung on a plane and flown today.
So what was the hardest part to find, Nick?
Money.
Good answer.
Thank you. The fact that I was able to get all those parts from from eBay, everything I needed in one shot, was really what put it over the top.
So Nick, your attention to detail and history is amazing. How did that section you found come to be, the one you found on eBay, come to be in Alaska?
That there was an airplane that had crashed in a pretty remote area, pretty remote in 1945 or 46. All the red paint was from a post-war like rescue type airplane, SB-17H. And I'm sorry, I lost your question.
It was about how that tail section came to be in Alaska.
Yeah, it was through a crash.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's amazing someone kept it intact that long.
Yeah, and the guy did a really good job drilling it off the wreck. So we were able to use it as is.
Hey, Nick, Jim Hazelton, how are you?
Hey, Jim, good to see you.
Yeah, you too. Hey, quick question, kind of a tag along to the last question about the turret remains out of Alaska. You showed a couple of pictures of one that I think you said had come from South America as your starting point, and then you showed the remains of the actual Cheyenne from the wreck. Now, just out of curiosity, how much of each of those were incorporated into your end product, so to speak, along with what was restored by the guys out in California?
So everything you saw from Alaska was incorporated in it, and probably 75 or 80% of the original tail turret, the fuselage structure, was used. And I obtained this tail turret because I have to think about this, the B-17 Thunderbird, they decided to convert their airplane to look like an F. So they took their restored Cheyenne off and traded it to the Yankee Air Force Museum for bomb racks and other parts. The Yankee Air Force Museum removed the tail turret that I have, installed the tail turret from Thunderbird, and Thunderbird got the F tail turret that was on Homesick Angel at Offutt Air Force Base. And then I made a trade with a parts dealer who sent the Yankee Air Force Museum a bunch of internal, what I call giblets, little detail parts they needed, and they sent me the turret. So it was pretty involved. Took a couple of years to get done, but it got done.
Man, you weren't joking when you said it was a very complex trade.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic job, and a lot of respect to your uncle. Thank you.
Thank you.
Jared, did you want to ask a question? Your hand was raised.
Aaron, were you speaking with me?
Your hand is raised, so I didn't know if you had a question.
Yes, ma'am. I was just wondering, my grandpa was there from D-Day till around the first part of October of 44. I was just curious what changes he might have seen during the war while he was over there in the different tail sections of the plane.
What unit was he with?
The 569th Squadron.
Okay. It all depends on which airplanes he was assigned to. He could have flown in both the Steeplechase and the Cheyenne turret, depending on what airplanes were there.
I can find that out for you. Not now.
Thank you,
Jared,
Mr. Veronico,
I can
for
find
your
that out
time.
and send you the information.
Awesome.
Thank you, Jenny. Alan, you have a question?
Yeah, Nick, we're very proud of the 390th that you've seen to have us at least house this particular tail gunner for, equipment for some period of time. My dad was, he was born in 1900, and he ended up being the commanding officer of the 390th, but he loved flying. So when he was 18 years old, in the high school yearbook, it said, "What do you want to do?" And he said, "Be an aviator." So at 19 years old in 1919 in Kelly Field, he got his wings. But in listening to you and hearing all of the details of what you've done, it occurred to me that you must have a great love. Obviously, you have a great love, or you wouldn't have done something like this. So my question is, what ignited, if you will, your interest in doing something like this? It must be very deep within you. So I'm just interested in that.
Thank you. And a lot of respect to your dad for commanding the 390th and taking such good care of the men there. But I blame this all on my parents. My mom and dad had private pilot's licenses when we were kids. And my brother flies for a commercial airline. So when I would go for a ride, I'd be taking pictures out the side. So I became more interested in journalism. And I went on to be a crew member of NASA's SOFIA Airborne Telescope, which is a 747 with a 106-inch telescope in the back. And I flew 79 missions, 10-hour missions on that. So lots of aviation in my family. And I just enjoy it.
Well, thank you very much. You'd be interested to know that my dad was not a professional military guy, but he was on, he'd go on active duty in the 50s. He'd go on active duty and he would say, he'd leave at 4 a.m. or something. He'd fly up to Alaska on a B-47 and come back that evening. So he was doing that until he got grounded because of his ears. He said that the sound of the B-17 finally got to, it degraded his ears, so he finally lost enough hearing so that he couldn't fly any longer. But he was flying in his 50s.
Wow, neat.
Jim, did you have a question?
Yeah, Nick, where did you find the information you had about the Cheyenne Modification Center and the different airplanes that they worked on and the building of the kit? I was kind of thinking that probably would have been disposed of at the end of the war because you're not making those anymore. But how'd you manage to find all that stuff?
Just research, I guess. There's a lot of stuff in the National Archives that's never been seen. The drawings of the Martin midget turret are one good example. My friend Alan Griffith found those for a separate project we were working on, and we were just amazed at what's out there.
Now, the Martin midget turret really wasn't used on a lot of aircraft. Is that correct?
It wasn't used on any.
None. Okay.
It was just a concept, a lightweight turret concept that they thought about for the YB-40.
Cool.
Nick, as someone who's not literate on this airplane, or many actually, I'm just curious about the time the gunner spent in the tail. You mentioned smoke and ejected shells, and of course being on your knees. What else can you tell us about the life of that man on a mission?
So they would ride in the radio compartment for takeoff and out to about the English Channel, where they'd get in the turret, test their guns, and hang out in the back until they got over enemy territory. And then, as you saw with the Cheyenne turret, the only piece of armor is that little piece of glass right in front of their face. So they would then, once they hit the enemy coast, get back into that compartment, and they were probably there for 4 or 5 hours. And then once they crossed the channel going back, they would vacate the turret and go up to the radio room. But they were kind of the pilot's eyes in the back of the airplane. They could communicate what was happening, how the formation looked, if there were airplanes coming from the rear, if airplanes were shot down. They could communicate if anyone got out. And all of this was vital information that was relayed during the debriefing once they landed. For example, when my mom's uncle's airplane got hit, they were hit head on by 40 FW-190s. The whole front of the airplane was on fire. Another pilot reported that the airplane left the formation and then tried to regain its place in the formation. And then another person mentioned, as a matter of fact, it was the top turret gunner who got out, who mentioned that my mom's uncle was still at his guns firing until the airplane essentially exploded. So everything that could be relayed, all those details were picked up by the tail gunner and then brought back to the debriefing.
Earl, did you have a question?
No, that was it. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys, everyone, for being here. I think this was really helpful. We are doing the unveiling of the tail turret at the museum today. I believe, and May correct me if I'm wrong, it will be on Facebook for the unveiling at 11:30 a.m. That's Mountain Standard Time. But we have set it up to also be available on Zoom. So that Zoom link is posted on our website. If someone is not on Facebook, just head to 390th.org. It's on our main page, and you can watch the unveiling. God willing, you can watch it at 11:30.
Technology willing.
Technology willing, yes. That the Manhattan Dolls will be performing, and we're pretty excited to be able to unveil it to the public too. So if you are unable to view it on Facebook, then check out the Zoom link that's on our website.
Yeah. If you go to the site, you'll see. Oh, I'm sorry. If you go to the site, you'll see a turret right in the middle, and there's a link that says "Learn More," and that will take you to all the details: Facebook, Zoom, whatever you want to do, so that you can join.
Can I ask you what time it is then? Because I'm in England, so I need to know when's 11:30.
It's 9:50 a.m. here right now.
So what time is
okay,
it?
Thank you.
Zulu -7.
Got the wrong symbol on the tail.
There's what?
The wrong symbol on the tail of that one you just showed. It's a triangle U. Ours is a square J.
Oh, Colonel Evans, are you calling the Colonel out, Colonel?
That's my plane.
Nice to see you, Richard. Well, and if some of you don't know, Richard Bouchon is our docent who also is a board member who also flew for the 390th, was a co-pilot and a pilot. And he is very well known in Tucson. Might I say even a star. So he has a book, My Wars is what it's called. And if you can purchase it on 390th.org's shop. And he does have some that if you send a little note, he will autograph them for you. So we can get those mailed out to whomever.